Hello, welcome to the Go Crisis podcast, where we tackle the impact of crises on individuals, on companies, on authorities, even on governments. And I'm joined, as ever, by the CEO of Go Crisis, Elmarie Marais. Elmarie, good to see you again.
Hi, David. Thank you. Good to see you too. We are talking today with a friend of mine called David Rimmer. And David's got an extraordinary story. I first heard his story a few years ago at Mark Dombroff's Aviation Symposium, which is a well-known event in aviation over in Washington. And it's the story just struck me as one that we can learn so much from in this industry.
It's as close as you get to unique, isn't it, in a
Yeah.
sense, as a story. In fact, let's just play, just as a tease, a little bit of what he had to say to us.
Well, there's never a day I don't think about it. And each day is a blessing sense, because you just never know. You never know what the day is going to bring. And certainly the victims didn't know that routine flight was going to be their last moment.
So we're going to come to that and explain all that for you. Before we do, though, I think we also felt it was worth you knowing a bit more about him, about David Rimmer, because there are a lot of pieces in the jigsaw which come together eventually. So here we are talking to David Rimmer.
Hi, David. It's very good to see you. Thank you for joining us. You and I know each other now for 4 years when Bob Webster introduced us to each other. And I always say that you're one of the most interesting and accomplished but kind-hearted people that I have ever met. So I want to introduce you to David Eads first and foremost before we start.
Elmarie, thank you. Hi, David. We don't really know each other. I mean, Elmarie has talked a lot about you, and you've got an amazing story that you're going to share with us in due course. But I think to get us to that point, we should hear a little bit about what you're up to now. So you're joining us you're in Manhattan right this moment, I think, aren't you? What are you up to?
That's correct. And thank you for inviting me to participate and for the kind words. I feel I can do nothing but disappoint you at this point, so I'll do my best. I'll do my best to live up to the introduction. I serve as an aviation consultant specializing in business aviation for the customers. After 20 years of senior leadership experience at various charter companies, I've come to a greater understanding of the needs of aircraft owners, aircraft buyers, business aircraft passengers, and I help them to find the best value and the safest option that they could use in business aviation. I help to educate them on getting the most for their money while also preserving safety and not being taken in by some of the marketing gimmicks that sometimes happen in our industry. And that's how I spend the majority of my time.
David, could I just ask you I'm not asking for names and pack drills, etc., but give me a sort of example as to what you've just told us actually means. What are you doing for people? What are you doing?
Well, if somebody is looking for a management company for their aircraft, for example, I help them navigate the options and help. I don't negotiate on their behalf, but I do help them with the proper questions they should ask to get a good understanding of what the provider will provide, where they may fall short, and background questions in terms of safety and culture that they should be asking that aren't obvious to the layperson. When you go out on the ramp of any FBO in the world, yeah, and you see all these shiny business jets, you have to realize that all operators are not created equal. All maintenance professionals are not delivering the same product. All pilots are not doing the same thing. So there are a lot of differences that are not readily apparent, and I try to help users understand those differences and why they're important to them.
I get it. I get it. So that really helps to explain. And obviously, your experience over decades within the industry has stood you in very good stead for that. But what's really interesting to me is that you're one of those rare breeds. You're a man with two careers. So you've got this amazing aviation history, but actually you started out in the media.
I did. I started in the radio industry when I was only 15 and a half. I spent most of my time for the next 20 plus years in various radio stations and radio networks in the talk radio business. So I've been in local radio stations in New York and Philadelphia, at the ABC and NBC radio networks in the United States, at Bloomberg. And ultimately, I owned a radio station for a short time. And
As you do.
As you
sorry?
do. Yes,
As you
as you
do.
do, as one does.
Well, it was certainly an educational experience. I'm not sure it's anything I would ever want to repeat, but we learn from the good things we do, and we learn from our mistakes. So
I was going to say you're not in that business now, so we won't ask you how it all went. But thankfully, in many ways. Just one last thing: in the midst of what you're doing right now, you also have a role which I think is beyond admirable, actually, which is helping to get donor organs to the right place around the world. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I started doing it just after the COVID restrictions eased. I've done about 36 trips, and I fly from point A to point B, from a collection center to a transplant center, and just try to do my part to help save other people's lives. I'm very blessed, and I feel that I have an obligation to repay that and to pay it forward. And so that's one of the ways that I choose to do it. Some people do ask, they assume that I'm flying on private jets or sitting in first class, and nothing can be further from the truth. This is often tough duty. It's physically demanding. But as a resilient traveler, it's a role that suits me well. And it's gratifying to be able to give back in what little ways that I can.
David, it's so fascinating to me. And I said to you earlier, if I'm an organ donor, so I will really trust you to carry my heart around. But tell me, I'm so interested to know how you got into this and what does it entail on a practical level? Do you get a phone call and people say, there's someone on an operation table, we're ready to go? How does that really work in reality? And how did you get into it?
Well, just before the shutdown for COVID, I went to an informational session, and I don't really remember how I found out about it. But when I read the description, I said, "This is for me. This suits my temperament and my experience really well." And there were probably 24 people who showed up for the information session, which we did in Texas. And I think when people heard what the actual, this is not glamorous world travel, this is working world travel, and there's a big difference. And so I think that thinned the herd quite a bit of people who were still interested. And then COVID shut everything down, and I got my first call in the spring of 21, I believe was my first trip. I've done about 36. And we generally have at least a week or more notice of a possible trip, because certain things have to happen for the recipient and at the donor side. And they'll post opportunities, and those of us who are approved couriers will weigh in whether we're available, whether we're interested. And then they make a selection. We hear a few days later, and then we're dispatched on a trip. They'll send us the travel arrangements and details about the pickup and the drop off. And then it's on us to make sure that we have whatever necessary visas we need to secure, and make our accommodation arrangements. So it's definitely a collaboration between us and the people who dispatch us. And it's just a very
Wow.
gratifying thing to do, to to help, as I said, in my own little way.
Yeah, well, it's a great thing to do. I have to say, Elmarie, I thought it would be useful. You know that expression, everything for a reason. I think we've laid out all the reasons ahead of David's story in a sense,
Yeah,
because I think
yeah.
everything we've just heard feeds into your own extraordinary experience within aviation, and that is really, I think, what we want to home in on now, because um, you have had to deal with one of those great challenges I guess any individual would have to deal with, which is well, for you, would we call it a near miss in midair? Perhaps you could explain it a little bit.
Sure, it was 2006, almost going on 19 years this year, that we were delivering a brand new business jet from Embraer in Brazil, and we were on the first leg of a delivery trip from the factory town San Jose de Campos to New York City.
David,
And
just want to interrupt you. What was your role at that time for the company?
at the time I was oh, that's a good question. I think I was senior vice president of Excellair, and I was responsible for sales, marketing, and business development. And we were en route from the factory town to our first stop in Manaus. And along the way, we had a midair collision with the Gol Airlines Boeing 737-800.
Wow, I mean, when you say mid-air collision, to me as a layperson, that's the end of the line. So what exactly happened?
Well, and for most people, it is the end of the line. Miraculously, there were 7 of us aboard the Legacy 600, and miraculously, we survived, and our airplane landed without further incident, I guess you could say. But the 154 people aboard the airliner, they died. We were at an altitude of 37,000 feet,
Oof.
exactly the same route of flight, and the Boeing crashed to the ground about 3.5 minutes later. We landed 35 minutes later at a military base, not knowing what happened, by the way. We didn't know for some hours that we had been in a midair collision. We knew there was an event because we felt the jolt, we saw damage on the aircraft, but we had no idea that it was such a tragedy.
It is so absolutely incredible how you're in a mid-air collision, but you feel a jolt. And the result of that jolt ends into the tragic loss of 154 lives. So, but explain to us what your journey was like. What was it inside your aircraft? Did you see something? Was there a shadow? Explain that to me, because it's an absolute sort of unbelievable thing to think that something that big didn't feel that big for you when you were in the aircraft.
We saw nothing, and that's probably what's most shocking, that we didn't see it coming. We didn't see it as it tore off part of our wing or that we sliced their wing. We just didn't see anything. One of the pilots thought he may have seen a shadow, but the NTSB explained to us that with the closure rate of 1,000 miles an hour, essentially, they were going in one direction about 500 miles an hour. We were in the opposing direction at 500 miles an hour. They said just visually, your brain would not process anything that was out there at that kind of speed. So all we knew is that there was this, I don't know if jolt does it justice. We've all been in turbulence, and this is just a different level. And after this impact, Henry Yandel, who was one of our traveling party, looked out the window and said, "Guys, we've been hit." And it was sort of a random thought, because hit by what? It's too high
Yeah.
for birds. It was unlikely to be an airplane. But he looked out at the winglet and saw that it had been sheared off. It was just this jagged edge where it was just a beautiful upright piece of metal before the collision. And we heard warning signals from the cockpit because the autopilot kicked off, and the crew, I wouldn't say struggled to gain control. we never really lost control. They just had to adjust how they were flying because the airplane had been severely impacted by the collision. And we were left for the next 35 minutes to think about what happened, what our fate was going to be, whether we could land safely. And as the time went by and we looked closer at the wing and we saw the damage was much more extensive than just the shearing of the winglet. And Ralph Michelli, our director of maintenance, was able to look at the tail from the rear seats of the airplane and saw that it too had been, a portion of it had been sliced off, almost surgically. And you would think that most mid-airs do not, certainly at that altitude and that speed, most mid-airs result in everybody's death somehow, and for some reason we were spared.
I mean, there's a whole catalogue of things that comes together here, David, because, you know, we were talking about your media background earlier. You had brought on board a very senior, highly reputable journalist to cover your story, your very positive story as well. So here, suddenly thrown into the mix is I mean, this is a scoop and a half, I suppose, for him. But obviously, you're already probably having to think, well, we've got to manage the situation a bit here.
And not knowing what we were managing was disconcerting. But we had invited Joe Sharkey, who was writing for Business Jet Traveler magazine and was also the business travel correspondent for the New York Times. And before we scheduled this delivery flight, we had hired a publicist. And one of the things I said to her was that on my wish list of things to do PR wise was to be covered and written about by Joe. He was the foremost voice in journalism covering business aviation. So I said, why don't we invite him as a guest on this delivery flight? It's nothing but positive story, brand new airplane, talk about Excellair and the delivery process and our professionalism. And then here we are with what became a New York Times reporter as opposed to a Business Jet Traveler reporter primarily, having a first-person account of one of the biggest human tragedies and biggest news events, certainly of that year, and in many ways of in aviation, certainly of all time.
And being a survivor as well, being a survivor along with you.
He was so that was sort of the dichotomy, because he was a survivor among us, and in practical terms, we had concern about how this would reflect on us.
Yeah.
I remember when we landed, so I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but one of the things he said when we landed the second time, when we landed for our initial police interviews, Joe stood up and announced, I have to let everybody here know that I'm a working journalist on assignment, and I have to make you all aware of that. And it was a jarring moment because we had this collegial relationship, and now suddenly he became of concern, because we had to use a degree of caution about our conversation and about speculation and about pointing fingers at anybody. So it changed the dynamic.
It must have done, and I guess, well, very quickly, once you're on the ground, you are now part of a much bigger investigation, and you've lost all control probably in terms of managing your own situation, those of your pilots. They were obviously the ones probably in the hottest seat of all,
and we didn't know that in the beginning. And I think part of it is perhaps we were being naive. We had just come through a big trauma, so we were still processing all the events that had happened. But for the first few hours after we landed, we didn't know it was a midair collision. So it was just about having survived something. We didn't know what, but it was about survival. And it was just about us. So we landed at this very remote military base with virtually no ability to communicate with the outside world. And I remember we were sitting down to eat. We were just, full of adrenaline and rejoicing in a way that we weathered something. And then in the middle of dinner, Daniel Bachman, who worked for Embraer and was our only Portuguese speaker in the airplane, came to us and said, "Guys, I have some news for you." And he said, "There's an airliner missing."
Wow.
And that obviously changed the entire tenor of what our conversation was, because we realized this was not just a matter of good fortune for us, but possibly great tragedy for other people. And it was a lot to process. And again, there was very little information, next to no information coming to us. And we just, it became very somber very quickly.
Were you at that point, of course, the shock of the news, did you at that point sit down and go, guys, let's think this through, what does this mean for us? Should we think about next steps? What did that feel like for you, and what did the conversation look like after that?
One of the first things we did when we landed was we tried to reach out to our family, friends, and colleagues, just to let them know we didn't want the news cycle to get ahead of our being able to tell them that we're okay. So we sent in, and we were relying on the largesse of the commanders of the base to gain access to the internet, because Wi-Fi wasn't working on our phones and there was no cell service. So one of the first things we did was I composed an email that was addressed to all of our immediate family and to our colleagues saying, "We're okay. Something happened at 37,000 feet. We don't know what it was," because this was before we knew about the collision. But we just want to reassure you that we're okay, and we're going to communicate with you directly as quickly as we can. But we have some inability to communicate right now. And we at least wanted to set the stage for not having to worry about being worried about by our loved ones and our colleagues. And then it went from there. And then when everything changed a couple of hours later, it didn't change our inability to communicate. It didn't change our lack of access to news. So we were in the dark. There wasn't much to speculate about except to wonder what could have happened, how it could have happened, and how we could be sitting there talking about it. But we had so few facts that until the next morning, we had very little to work with.
The
And
point at which,
sorry, David, go ahead.
no, you go ahead, Elmarie.
I wanted to know, once the news reached you that there was another aircraft involved, did the attitude towards you change from the locals?
Not immediately. They were still, and for the entire stay on the base, which was about 26, 27 hours, I want to say, they were nothing but polite to us, hospitable to us, and I can find no fault in how we were treated there. It could have been much worse. I know that in hindsight. And we were just fortunate that that people first were focused on the shock of us landing at their base, followed by the shock the next morning of search and rescue going on from that base. Things started to evolve and break down a little bit as the day went on, but the people who were the military were were nothing but welcoming and helpful to us.
But I guess I mean, were the majority of those who lost their lives, were they Brazilian? Were David?
Yes,
Yeah.
they were.
So, I mean, in the crudest of terms, and this is a crude journalistic thought, you've got some jet-setting Americans who've had a collision with a whole load of our people who are now missing or now known to have died. I imagine that's a pretty scary position for you to be in when you realize there is an investigation to be carried out here. You're on Brazilian soil, you're in their hands. Things are going to move very, very fast and conceivably not in your favor.
Absolutely. And I think the slow release of information was certainly our friend while we were on the base. And once the media frenzy started to whip up, and then the political frenzy started to engage, we were in more public settings and in bigger places. And so I think less vulnerable in the immediate term to anything happening to us without witnesses. It was, I don't believe that any vigilantism would have taken hold at the base, although curiously, there were a couple of pictures taken of the crew by people at the base that were released later on. So there was an inkling among the people who were serving that this was something big, but it didn't get in the way of our treatment.
But it's an extraordinary case of crisis management, if we look at it in the crudest terms, which you've got to deal with here. And I just wonder, again, it may be jumping forward a little bit, but in terms of the pilots, what was their position then? And indeed, how has that unfolded over time?
Well, the dynamic the next morning when we woke up, we spent the night in barracks, which had TVs with two channels on with, I think they were both movie channels. There was no news crawl at the bottom. There was nothing to inform us of what was happening, but the next morning everything had changed. And they took the pilots, and I believe our director of maintenance, Ralph, and maybe Daniel Bachman, over to the airplane to help investigators try to piece together the state of the airplane and to flip switches as they needed to. And there were times that we would be asked questions that these were outsiders who tried to make it sound casual, but it clearly wasn't casual. And we had a conversation and decided we were not going to answer questions from people, A, who didn't identify themselves or their role, or B, who didn't share a common language with us that could be easily translated. So our guard went up the next day as more and more people started arriving at the base. So we wanted to be careful not to offend, but we also were very cautious about the level of cooperation that we gave without being fully informed about what we were being asked and by whom.
And did you have legal advice at this point, or when did you start realizing this is getting serious? I mean, of course, probably the minute you heard that there's another aircraft involved, but there must have been a point where you thought we probably need some help here.
It really got serious when we were flown off the base the next evening. And we were told that we would have legal assistance once we went into the next town, and that proved not to be the case. And the U.S. Air Force attaché to Brazil showed up ostensibly to protect the interests of the United States as opposed to our interests. I think our interests were incidental at that point. And it became clearer the risk that was happening, and our concerns obviously deepened. And we were at least able to communicate with others outside of our party, which was a big help. It wasn't a complete solution, but at least it was leading us in the direction of being able to protect ourselves.
let's throw this forward again a bit, David, then, because I'm really intrigued now by the sense of, you talk about an investigation, some sort of maybe mock casual questions. You're not quite sure where it's all going. Give us now what was the reality for this legal journey, if you like, for the two men then who were flying that plane, because it's been from what I understand, a pretty bumpy ride for them. Sorry about the language, but a very difficult journey for them in terms of simply being able to have this case dealt with, closed down. They've done nothing wrong. It has not been easy, has it?
No, and the reality was that from the moment that people started asking questions at the base, I realize now it was criminalization that was being talked about. And those were, we haven't had accidents typically in the United States criminalized. It's really the exception in an aviation accident. But the fact that criminalization was unfolding so quickly was, it was a new experience to everybody involved. And we had to balance between between self-preservation and self-protection, and not wanting to trigger anybody to take more drastic action, whether that be imprisonment or whatever might follow if they felt that we were being evasive. So our first introduction to this really being the subject of criminalization was the federal police conducted interviews with all 7 of us when we reached the police station in Cuiabá. And we were obviously still full of adrenaline from what happened and shock. And they had 2 separate interview rooms in which a federal police representative would ask a question. It was translated by a translator. You would answer the question. The translator would recite the answer back to the investigator. And in my room were the U.S. Air Force attaché and a representative of the manufacturer. So it wasn't a sterile interview environment. It was a little bit casual, it seemed, because when you look at it, we had a vested interest in the outcome of the case and whatever was going to happen, as did the manufacturer. So really, when you look back at it, to have the manufacturer present for the questioning is a little bit of a conflict.
Yeah.
But there was no attempt to figure out who was in the room, why they were in the room, or whether to keep anybody out of the room. At the end of the questioning, and I was the first to be questioned in this room, they handed me a statement that purported to be an accounting, not a transcript, but a narrative of what questions were asked and how I answered them. And they wanted me to sign it. And so I turned to the U.S. Air Force attaché and I said, I don't speak Portuguese. I can't possibly attest to what's in this document. So he asked to take a look at it. He reviewed it. He said, this is a pretty good accounting of what you said. And I said, but I'm not comfortable signing something that I don't understand. You know, instincts kick in. There's no playbook for this. So it just becomes instinctual at this point.
And I think, sorry to interrupt you very briefly, but I keep on thinking if that was me or, how I would have reacted. And I sort of feel like some people might have gone, I'll sign whatever, just to be, just to sort of show that you are working with them and to move the process along so you can get out of there, so it's incredible that you had your wits about you.
Well, the problem is whatever you sign, whatever you say, it's forever. And it's hard to take back. So I was of right mind to the extent anybody could be after this kind of event. And you just had to go with what your gut told you. Interestingly enough, just to step back a little bit, we thought we would have legal representation, which could help inform us of what our rights might be in Brazil, which are different from what we're accustomed to in the US. And the sole attorney that was there was on behalf of the manufacturer. And we were told that he would be a resource for us. And I introduced myself and I said, so you're here to help us out? He said, no, I'm here for Embraer. If you have any questions, I'll answer them. But he made it clear that he was not there for us or to protect our rights or to help protect our interests.
Which
So
makes
that
sense. It makes sense now, doesn't it?
it does. And it just left us feeling very exposed because again, we're now 36 hours into this event and we have nobody there representing our interest except ourselves. So it's you feel very naked. You feel very unaware of what you should say and what you should do. And, again, we weren't sure what was going to trigger them. So I followed the direction of the Air Force attaché and I went to the other six and I said, listen, here's how this is going to unfold. They're going to question you in another language. You're going to answer in English. They're going to transcribe it. They're going to present you with a document. And here's what we've been advised to do. And I think it's sound. So I suggest that you follow it. So everybody did. And a sort of a strange thing happened while we were waiting around for everybody to complete their interviews. We were introduced to a gentleman who I still don't know who he is or what he does. He was in a white medical coat, so he looked like a doctor, maybe. And he had each of us pose shirtless. It was a very odd moment. I mean, I don't want to be.
It sounds like a mugshot to me. That's what I would have interpreted that as.
And
Not that
except
I've
for the
seen many naked mugshots, but you know
It's
what
just
I mean.
weird, isn't it? Yeah.
The topless aspect was kind of odd. And what it turned out to be, and this speaks to David, to your questions earlier about the kind of treatment we had at the base, we were told after the fact that it was to prove that we were not subject to physical abuse at the base.
Wow.
Okay.
So obviously other people felt that we were at risk of being physically harmed there, and they were just looking to prove that we weren't. So that again is just
So everybody's guard,
disconcerting.
everybody's guard is up in a sense. So everyone's sort of making sure they're trying to cover their own bats at the same time. I did want to ask you. I mean, I think there are two things I really want to know. I sort of want to know. So how did it all end? What happened at the end? What happened to the pilots? What happened to you? And then I have another issue that I'm really keen to discuss.
Sure. The upshot was that a media and politically influenced criminal prosecution happened years later, and the pilots, along with some air traffic controllers, were criminally convicted. The pilots, fortunately, in absentia in the United States. The pilots lost their passports a couple of days later. They were seized by the Brazilian federal police with the cooperation, shockingly, of the United States embassy and consulate. And we fought on the courts for two and a half months. They were in country for 60, I think it was 71 days.
Wow.
Pilots were forced to stay in Brazil without passports as we fought to the courts to get their passports back. And we didn't benefit from any special help from the US government or anyone. We just followed the rules. We just followed procedure and were able to get their passports back and be able to have them fly home without any further harm coming to them.
And how did you support them? I mean, to be in such an uncertain position for so long must have really impacted their mental health. How did you support them? How did you support their families? What did that look like?
It was certainly challenging to know that two of your colleagues are at risk imprisonment or some kind of physical assault for that long. I stayed for a week after the accident. Most everybody trickled out over the course of a few days after the accident. I stayed to make sure that they were represented by qualified attorneys, and that we had PR in place to help combat some of what was happening in the media. It was a very stressful period. They were protected by security 24/7. They largely didn't leave their hotel for much of the duration. It relaxed a little bit when the acute coverage by the media tapered off. We flew their families down. We supported their families. I can't begin to imagine what it was like to be one of the pilots and to be living in that sort of fear. And I know that it took a toll on not only the others who were on board the airplane, but also the rest of the company, because it was a terrible tragedy and a terrible trauma. And this is not to minimize or overlook the 154 people who died, and their family and friends and loved ones and colleagues who were much more deeply impacted than we were. So we were certainly mindful of our good fortune and their tragedy, and also looking to clear the pilots' names, to clear the company of the accusations that were being hurled at us. It was a balancing act, and we had continuity of business issues that we had to deal with, because 150 people depended on us to put food on their table and to have health insurance and pay their kids' school bills. So we were certainly aware that we had an obligation to keep moving forward so that they can continue to work and draw a paycheck, and that the company wouldn't be destroyed by it, that the pilots wouldn't go to jail, and that we could recover to the extent we could. It was definitely a balancing act with a lot of people. Every day was a challenge, because there'd be some new news report, erroneous news report, criminal charge, criminal accusation. So it was a juggling act that was especially pronounced during the time that they were still in Brazil.
That gave you obviously a lot of concerns, anxieties, things to work on. But can I ask you, David, did you also suffer a degree of survivor guilt? I mean, you escaped miraculously. 154 people didn't. I just wonder how that has borne on you over the years.
I wouldn't say it's guilt, because I have never believed that our actions caused this. So I've felt compassion. I felt a sense of mystery about why us, why them. Was it really the day for all 154 people to die? And then the question of, what do we do with this gift that we have? And I still don't have the answers to it, but I wouldn't say guilt. And I think I always fear that I come across as lacking compassion when I say that, but our lives just happened to intersect in a way that was tragic for a lot of people. Yet our survival, I don't think, is something that I've felt guilt about.
But I mean, I can still sense it 20 years later, that it had a profound impact on your life. And I suppose that really explains the start of this conversation of your deep commitment to giving back.
Well, there's never a day I don't think about it. And each day is a blessing sense, because you just never know. You never know what the day is going to bring. And certainly the victims didn't know that routine flight was going to be their last moment. And yeah, I try to be mindful that no matter what I've experienced, that there are countless people who truly suffer in this world and truly need help. And I've tried to find the reason for my survival and what to use it for. One of the things I use it for is I try to inform people of the risks, to remind people of the risks of what we do. Aviation is not a risk-free endeavor, and I think that complacency is our enemy. I think people believing that it only happens to bad guys is dangerous thinking. And so I do try to be as open about the experience as I can. And as I said before, I try to give back as I can.
Well, David, it's been a fascinating story. Thank you very much for sharing it. I'm sure it's not something you want to do every day, but we appreciate it, and very good to meet you. So thank you very much for your time.
Likewise, thank you for having me.
Thank you, David. Hope to see you very soon.
Same here.
I told you this, listening to David's story will not disappoint. He's fascinating, a very accomplished aviator, and a career dedicated now to safety. When I asked him to give me a few takeaways after this podcast, he gave a few that, and I mentioned to him, this happened 20 years ago, and I've recently responded to an incident in January, and I felt like that incident was almost as if it was 10 years ago. We keep on learning the same lessons and we keep on making the same mistakes, which is unfortunate. But what he said was preparation was number one for him. Preparation, get your emergency plans alive, living. He used the word living ERP plan, that you exercise, that you test. And ERP is emergency response plan. In aviation, that's the word that they use, ERP. So he said, it's got to be current. You've got to exercise it. You've got to have the muscle memory to be able to deal with the scenarios. He also mentioned, of course, that it's not, there's so many variables and different scenarios and different challenges, but you can get yourself just one step closer to doing a good job by having these plans in place and testing them and exercising them. And then the last thing that he said, which was really interesting. So we talk a lot about crisis communications and what you should say and can't say, and when you should say that and why you should speak up. And he said one of the regrets that he had was the silence that they were told not to speak. So the silence created a vacuum that was filled by so-called experts and by the media. And till this day, those sort of unverified or inaccurate accounts are still echoed in the media today. So his message really there is, you've got to speak up. We always say what you do and also do what you say.
I think you've summed that up very nicely. There's one phrase he also threw at us later on, Elmarie. Your allies may become your adversaries. So whatever you do, make sure you're prepared. I thought it was a great contingency message for us to take away. David Rimmer, what a good guy as well. Good to see you too. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.